I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you to tonight's Mercedes-Benz Foreign Policy Forum with Ruth Ben-Ghiat. And she will deliver a lecture entitled Strongmen, How They Rise and Rule and Why They Fall. This Mercedes-Benz Foreign Policy Forum is made possible through the generous support of the Mercedes-Benz Fonds im Stifterverband für Deutsche Wissenschaft. Previous lectures that have been supported by this fund have included former U.S. Ambassador to the European Union, Tony Gardner, Ambassador and now CIA Director Bill Burns, and political scientists Lynn Vavreck, among many others over the years. And I'm particularly delighted to welcome Eckhard von Kleden, who is the Prime Minister in Berlin, shall we say, or the Chancellor of Mercedes-Benz here in Berlin. And now let me turn to tonight's talk. The national leader as strongman is a phenomenon I think that we are all at the moment acutely aware of. Only a day's drive from here, Vladimir Putin, the preeminent strongman of our time, is waging a war of extraordinary brutality as part of a classic strongman campaign seeking to recreate an imperial ideal of Russian greatness. To the southeast, one-time reformer Viktor Orban has suffocated public discussion and undermined the rule of law in a European Union member state. There are so many others that we can discuss. It is the most challenging time for democracy, one could say, since the catastrophic 1930s and 40s. And the news today about the turmoil across the British Channel does not help. Tonight, our speaker, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, will bring the strongman phenomenon into ever sharper focus. Ruth is a professor of history and Italian studies at New York University, where she focuses on authoritarianism, democracy protection, and propaganda. She is an opinion columnist for MSNBC and has published scores of articles, op-eds, and essays on the CNN website, in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Washington Post. She is the model of an engaged academic. She also publishes a newsletter about democracy and autocracy called Lucid. Ruth Ben-Ghiat is the author or editor of 6 books, including Fascist Modernities and Italian Fascism's Empire Cinema, which details what happens to societies when authoritarian governments take hold, and it explores the appeal of strongmen to collaborators and other followers. The latter book won the Edinburgh Gatta Prize for Best Book on Italian Culture in 2019. Her latest publication is, of course, Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present, published in 2020. This was in our house long before Ruth was even scheduled to come to the Academy because my very inquisitive undergraduate son decided he had to read it first. Luckily, he left it behind because he didn't want to pack it in his backpack when he went back to college. The Washington Post has said of the book that Ruth Ben-Ghiat has a gift for bringing together details both poignant and startling and laying them out with particular aplomb. Professor Ben-Ghiat is the recipient of both Fulbright and Guggenheim Fellowships. This past May, she had the enviable experience of being the Ria S. Hederman Critic in Residence at the American Academy in Rome. And we are really delighted that she could fit us in on her current European trip. Before I give her the floor, just let me say a few words. Ruth will speak for about a half hour, and after that, she and I will have a bit of a conversation, and then we will open it up for audience question and answer. You know how to deal with questions here. Those of you who are joining us by Zoom, please type your question into the Q&A part of the Zoom platform, not into the chat. We apologize in advance if we can not get to all the questions. Ruth, the floor is yours. Welcome to Berlin.
Thank you all so much for coming. And thank you to Daniel Benjamin and Berit Ibert and Isabel and everybody else at the Academy for inviting me to speak. I'm delighted to be here. So we're living through historic times when the global clash between democracy and autocracy is coming to a head. Authoritarianism is ascendant. Over 60% of the world's population is now living under some kind of illiberal rule. And yet, the spread of illiberal rule has sparked an unprecedented wave of resistance around the world. 2019 was a record year globally for nonviolent protest. And so, for example, in Chile, they had the biggest protests since the days of the dictatorship about economic inequality. And we don't hear about this record year for protest as much. And of course, in 2020, in the middle of a pandemic, the largest protest in US history unfolded. Black Lives Matter engaged around 20 million people in the US and millions more abroad. So authoritarian states have long claimed that they offer a more efficient model of governance than democracy. And one of the reasons I wrote Strongmen, I wanted to look into and debunk some of these myths. And in fact, they bring ruin to societies. For profit motives, they're linked to energy sources that accelerate the climate crisis, they plunder business, and their corruption and repression causes wastes of human and other capital and forces millions into exile. At a time when we face climate, health, food, and other crises, the priority of authoritarian states is not public welfare, but maintaining stability and keeping the leader in power. Those resisting around the world today know that strongmen don't just endanger democracy, but pose an existential threat to humanity. So, I'm going to take you on a journey, so starting with how they rise. For 100 years, charismatic leaders have found favor at moments of uncertainty and transition, when traditional parties and political systems no longer seem to meet the needs of the moment. They often come from outside the political system. They create new movements and political alliances. They kind of rejigger things, and they communicate with their followers in original ways. Picking up on powerful drives and resentments, they present themselves as the vehicle for obtaining what is most wanted, whether it's territory, jobs, safety from racial enemies, or revenge for mistreatment by foreign powers. So the victimhood complex is very powerful. Authoritarians also appeal when societies have made recent gains like in social progress. Could be gender, could be workers' rights, racial emancipation, equity. They soothe fears of the loss of male domination, elite privilege, and the end of white Christian civilization. So how do you spot a strongman on the rise? So today, authoritarians come to office more likely than not via elections, and they actually use their campaigns to distinguish themselves as strongmen and test out a society's tolerance for lawless behavior. So there's a lot of testing during the campaign. One way they do this is professing their sympathies for violence or a personal capacity for violent acts. In countries with a history of dictatorship, they might hold up that violent past as a model, and that's what Jair Bolsonaro did and continues to do in Brazil, which had an over 20-year military junta. In the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte talked fondly about having thrown people out of helicopters and said he'd do it again. This is how he campaigned. And of course, January 2016, very early in his campaign, Trump did this counterintuitive thing, if you think as a Democrat, and boasted about shooting someone on Fifth Avenue and not losing any followers. But this is a very strongman thing to do. From the start, strongmen tell us who they are and what they intend to do, but we don't listen. Conservative elites are the strongmen's most important promoters and collaborators. Afraid of losing their class, gender, or race privileges, influential individuals bring the aspiring strongman into the system, thinking he could be controlled. They strike what's called an authoritarian bargain. That's a concept I work with in the book. with the leader, prosperity for them in return for loyalty and toleration of violence and suspension of rights. And here's something that hasn't changed for 100 years. It's very sad. Those who sign on early tend to stick with the leader no matter what he does. And there are defectors, but not many. They just stick with him. And a recent example is, of course, the U.S. Republican Party's continuing support for Trump through impeachments, mismanagement of pandemic, and even a coup attempt. So many can find this puzzling, but it's very in line with authoritarian dynamics. So this brings us to personality cults, which are key to the operation of authoritarianism. And this is something else hasn't changed in 100 years. The leader has to be a man of the people, but also a man above all other men. So he's the everyman, and he's the superman. Now, when a society, an authoritarian society, starts to puff up the leader's personality cult, you know that's just not a good sign. There's trouble brewing. And it means there's growing disaffection in society, there's going to be a crackdown, or there is a crackdown on the way, or foreign aggression. In China, the current inflation of Xi Jinping's cult to consolidate his power with a third term, the Congress is going on now, accompanies heightened domestic discontent because of the economic slowdown, exposure of human rights crimes against Muslims, and Western pushback against imperialist claims on Taiwan. But here you have the man of the people who cares about the people. So the man of the people, a man above all other men. So I'm going to take you on a little tour of the tools of rule of the authoritarian playbook: propaganda, machismo, corruption, and violence. So start with propaganda. Many definitions of propaganda. One I'm using here is it's a set of communication strategies designed to discourage critical thinking and persuade people that reality is what the leader says it is. And having a direct communications channel of the leader and the followers, unmediated, is key. And they use rallies for 100 years. Trump used Twitter. Modi has a very lively Instagram. And they expertly use the latest media technologies, whatever those are, at the time. So Mussolini, when he came to power, film was silent during the 1920s, and he was a natural at gesticulating. The Nazis invested in the latest sound technology because of the power of Hitler's voice for the radio. And here is Modi as a hologram when he ran for office in 2014. And the key is that you're omnipresent and you're kind of godly, right? And he was the first to use a hologram. Berlusconi had used satellite TV. So they're very expert at capitalizing on the latest media technologies. So propaganda may seem to be all about noise, but silence, we don't hear enough about this. Silence is equally important to its operation. Strongmen disappear people, and they also disappear knowledge that conflicts with their ideologies and goals. Chilean dictator Pinochet closed down philosophy and social science departments, claiming they were laboratories of Marxism. Viktor Orban banned gender studies, and authoritarians everywhere are banning books with LGBTQ themes and suppressing climate change science. In the U.S., Republicans are disappearing discussions of racism and slavery from public education and trying to intimidate academics into silence. So this is Professor Watchlist, which I found out I have been put on. It's the Koch-funded Campus Reform Turning Point. And they give you a page, and they have a pretension to, being very academic. They have all your citations. But the key is at the bottom, they helpfully provide a phone number so people can call and try and get you fired. Now, in my case, I'm at a private university. It doesn't bother me much. But there are people on there who are at public universities. So this is part of so we always hear about propaganda as noise. But trying to censorship and trying to intimidate people into silence, the silence is deafening in an authoritarian state. So machismo. Machismo, so Strongmen was the first book that really took machismo seriously, and I elevate it to be a tool of rule just as important as propaganda, as violence. And women are as much the strongmen's enemies as prosecutors and the press. So are LGBTQ people, whose persecution is a through line over 100 years of authoritarianism. And the gender politics of authoritarianism has three pillars. One is institutionalized misogyny. So you're putting women down, taking away reproductive rights. At the same time, you're pumping up men. You're exalting hypermasculinity. And then the third is you're suppressing other models of manhood and sexual identities. And that's the persecution of gays and today trans. So Mussolini and Putin, they bookend. They are the two leaders who made the most use of their body, the half-clothed, half-naked body. And so here, this is very interesting. So he's being a man of the people. So he's threshing grain with peasants. But he's got these state-of-the-art pilot's goggles. So he's different. So you can't just be the man of the people. You must be the man above all other men. And then here we have Putin on his every man's fishing vacation, but he's not every man, of course. Now, what's also interesting, and I track this among the sitting leaders, when do they dose out this hypermasculinity? Well, when they have problems, challenges to their rule. So 2019, the biggest protests in Russia for many years, Putin decides to go with his biker friends, wearing a leather jacket. So here's Trump, who I really wanted to include this in my book, but was unable to get permission. Now, he can't use his own body, so he borrowed Sylvester Stallone's body from Rocky III. Now, the reason I have this is a personality cult product because, sadly, pathetically, this is not a retweet. He made this, or somebody made this, and it's an original tweet from his now suppressed account. So, we can laugh at things. It's ridiculous, right? As you could say, it's grotesque. But the strongman's masculine identity is not empty posturing. It's a sophisticated strategy of political legitimation. The appeal of these leaders lies in their ability to get away with things that ordinary men cannot. And that's how we get to corruption. Getting away with it is the essence of authoritarianism. So, strongmen personalize power, and the analytical framework of my book is personalist rule, which I won't bore you with the whole thing about it, but meaning that private political and financial interests prevail over national ones in shaping policy. So Trump spent, and I will never get over this fact as an American, Trump spent 1/3 of his time in office before the pandemic hit visiting Trump-branded properties. So from 2017 to the end of 2019, 1/3 of his time was spent promoting Trump. So turning public office into private profit. Putin, of course, has the most fully realized kleptocracy since Gaddafi, so funneling profits from his plunder of state institutions. And this is the 21st century. You don't have just the gold in the Swiss banks. You have the offshore finance, and you have the accounts held, not in your own name. You have proxies and cronies. So here's another myth. We hear how authoritarianism is good for business. But we don't hear as much about actual examples of autocrats preying on business. And this happens at a staggering scale. Between July 2016 and 2020, Erdogan seized over $32 billion worth of assets, mostly from followers of Fethullah Gulen, this cleric in exile he's obsessed with, but not only, with all Kurds, all kind of people. As for Putin, from 2000 to 2010, a shocking 1/3 of businesses were targeted for raids. 70,000 people were jailed between 2002 and 2012 on technicalities or fabricated tax evasion charges. And I interviewed for my newsletter Bill Browder, and he said if you've got a business that grows to a certain amount or it's appetizing, the state will come after it. But we don't hear about this. We hear about how authoritarianism brings stability. But this is another way that authoritarianism is simply not sustainable. So corruption isn't just financial. It depends on changes in moral codes and professional ethics. It's about getting people to accept things that were previously considered illegal or immoral. Strongmen specialized in making the unthinkable and bringing it into being, making the unthinkable possible. They are innovators in lying, in thievery, and of course, in violence. And one of the things in my violence chapter, which was not very fun to write, I tried to look at what was the innovation of each of my protagonists in the violence area. So Putin does the poisonings, etc. Rulers who come into office with a criminal record, like Mussolini and Hitler, or when they're under investigation, Putin, Trump, Berlusconi, they know that making the government a refuge for lawless people is good because it speeds up the corruption process. The more criminals you have in government, the better it is for, changing the political culture. Corruption is also why strongmen establish what are called inner sanctums, these inner circles with families, sycophants, flatterers who keep their secrets and serve as liaisons with other criminal elements. So the brother of Serbian President Vučić, he's powerful in politics, but he's feared for his reputed connections to the Kosovo mob. Now, Berlusconi was very efficient. His right-hand man, Marcello Dell'Utri, he had one man who was his liaison with Opus Dei, like the extreme Catholic sect, and the mafia. So you have the church and the mafia with one person. And Marcello Dell'Utri was actually convicted of mafia association in the early 2000s, but kept on being a senator because he could. So go to violence. It's an interesting quote from Putin. For 100 years, the strongman and his enablers have led societies they govern to think of harming others as justifiable, necessary, and even patriotic. The history of authoritarian violence is clear on what happens when polarization, which is me versus you, becomes survivalism. It's me or you, and only one of us is going to survive. And right now, among the far right, there's a lot of survivalism circulating. One ideology is great replacement theory. The idea that non-whites are having babies, demographic change is going to make white people extinct. So you have to have this specter of obliteration, extinction, and get people to think they're in mortal danger. And that's what people who study political violence, that's what you need to push people to be willing to, go after people in their own community, for example. Okay. The violence the strongman unleashes is also his reaction to his fear. He's secretly afraid of the people he represses, of elites who might turn on him, and enemies who want to remove him from the face of the earth. Fear is why he uses blackmail, why he throws on his cloak of masculine invincibility, and why he builds palaces and bunkers to hide in when his mismanagement catches up with him or he makes a bad decision. So here's Lukashenko, right? When the protesters were marching on his palace, he went in the helicopter and he had like his bulletproof vest and an assault rifle and he was buzzing the crowd. So that was the fear-motivated behavior. So that leads us to the fall of strongmen. The authoritarian playbook has no chapter on failure. And very interesting thing is that every leader who declines due to his own bad decisions is surprised at his fate and blames everyone else but himself. So I'm going to give just two quick cases of what I call autocratic backfire. The first is Putin. And Putin was ripe for a decision based on hubris and a lack of objective input. He'd become more vulnerable. The pandemic had weakened the Russian economy. His popularity was decreasing. In fact, a 2021 poll by Levada, which is an independent pollster, showed that almost half of Russians between 18 and 24 of age felt the country was going in the wrong direction. That's a lot of disaffection. So his popularity was decreasing, and thus his need to jail his critics and deceive his people was increasing. This is when strongmen act rashly. They have an intimation that they're at their peak. They start wars, they double down on ruinous military or domestic initiatives, and there's a name for this that I got from political scientists. I use it in the book, gambling for resurrection. You do one great risky thing that's going to save your reputation. And this is also like late autocracy. They start musing about their place in history, and Putin was doing all of these things. So I had a really strong feeling that the minute he did this invasion of Ukraine, that this was what was going on. So 2 days after it started, and it published 3 days after the war started, I published this in MSNBC saying this is not going to go well, because I just had this, from studying these guys for years, I had this sense. And indeed, what has come out since, that he didn't consult his military. He didn't game out the sanctions, possible sanctions, with economic advisors, even though they had the experience in 2014. And this is consistent with the mistakes that autocrats make, who think they have all the answers and surround themselves only with people who tell them what they want to hear. So what have we learned so far from this war? It's exposed. It's like drawn back the curtain on autocracy, exposing how corruption ravages institutions, the military, depriving them of resources, and then the phenomenon of institutionalized lying, where nobody wants to tell the leader the truth. And we've seen, there's been articles about this as a corrupt culture in the military. And the wars are also prompting many countries to have a long overdue reckoning with the cost of dependence on fossil fuel, and Russian fossil fuel in particular, and I think will ultimately accelerate the transition to clean energy. So now quickly, the other case study of gambling for resurrection, Mr. Trump, who refused to accept the results of the election. We all know this. And it's very interesting. If coups are 1/3 of my book, and I didn't think when I wrote about coups it would be applicable to America. But he actually first, as many of you know, he tried to have a military solution. He tried to get Michael Flynn to have martial law declared and rerun the election supervised by the military, which is total like junta stuff. And that didn't work, right? And then he tried electoral manipulation. And he had this big lie going. And I want to say something that's in the news a lot right now, because hundreds of GOP candidates are running on platforms of election denial. The ultimate goal, I'm always trying to see what's the end game. The goal of election denial is actually not just to refute one election, 2020, but to debase and degrade the idea of all elections in Americans' minds. So getting them to think of elections as so fraught because they could have places of violence, and especially corrupt and fraudulent, that the idea ultimately, this is like going down in the future, ultimately the idea of relying on elections to elect your leaders will be debased, will be corroded and compromised. And what does that open the door to? Other ways of having political transitions, like January 6th. So Trump also channeled early, oh, no, this is not what I wanted to do, sorry. There we go. He channeled early fascism. And as somebody who studied Italian fascism, when he called everybody to come to Washington, D.C. and save him, this was, January 6th was many things, but it was also a rescue operation of a leader cult. And he called the faithful to come and save him from this unjust fate. And he also used survivalist rhetoric. He said at the rally, if we don't fight, we won't have a country anymore. Like there'll be nothing. So this is the last frame of the propaganda film that was shown at the rally. And his face filled the screen. And so as they went off from the rally, all charged up to go and assault the Capitol, his face followed them. So it was total fascist stuff. And having written a book on fascist film propaganda, there are lots of fascist films that end with the Duce's face filling the screen because that's your whole reality. So I couldn't believe it when I saw this, and that's how it ends. So just a few things to conclude. January 6th was a profoundly radicalizing event for the GOP. And it's really making history by transforming itself into an autocratic party. What does that mean? It's expunging the remaining elements that are democratic or people who are standing up for the rule of law. Who is it bringing in? Extremists, like actual extremists, like members of anti-government, violent organizations like Oath Keepers and Proud Boys. And of course, it's aligning itself with sitting autocrats like Orban. Right? There's that whole busy interchange between the GOP and Orban. Now, when we think about authoritarian parties and remaking a political culture, you ask these questions like, what are the personal qualities and vision that is desired in a candidate right now? Well, knowing how to shoot an assault rifle, spouting violent rhetoric, because so many candidates have ads in which they are doing this. And this is Dr. Oz, who had a 30-second campaign ad, this is still from it, in which he had handled 4 different weapons, including, he's showing here that he knows how to load and shoot. What? And so the point is that this goes back to the kind of the violence, showing that you are capable of violence. The same can be said with the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. Now, the GOP always had relations with them. And in fact, a little-known fact is GOP leaders and Trump used Oath Keepers and Proud Boys as their security, their bodyguards, at rallies for 4 years. So when they came on January 6th, this was just a continuation. But now the extremists are the politicians. So there's many, many examples I could mention, but Mark Fincham, who is a self-proclaimed proud Oath Keeper, he boasts about it. He's running for Secretary of State of Arizona. So the extremists are now becoming the politicians. So what does that mean? And just as Mussolini's March on Rome a century ago, if you were in the March on Rome, you got special status. You became a first-hour fascist. It was like a badge of honor. The same has happened for people who were in January 6th. And so many of those people were encouraged to run for office. So they're renewing the political class with people who are lawless, going back to my points before. Now, this is an upsetting picture that I have this newsletter, Lucid, and people are in it from also many foreign countries, but all over the States. And they send me things. So this is somebody who's driving around in Omaha, Nebraska, with an airbrushed picture of Biden as a hostage. Once, presumably, this person's idol, Trump, is back in office, and there's been justice rendered. And so I would say that one of the best measures in what Trump has done to America is that this person feels empowered to go around with a sitting president in this state on the back of his truck. Okay, conclusion. This is a bit of a bitter reflection by somebody who lived through over 20 years of Mussolini. So my background studying fascism was how I understood really early what the danger was of Trump after I saw him at a rally. And I really changed my professional life starting in 2016 to educate the public and educate journalists. So this was an op-ed I published a few days before Trump was inaugurated, saying that he was going to be following the authoritarian playbook. And of course, I got a lot of messages like, what are you, crazy? You know, how could that? There wasn't the framework there to understand it. That not only would he destroy U.S. democracy if he could, but he would extricate the U.S. from the international democratic order. And it was frustrating to me to see how slowly the media and the public had the language to talk about it. But when I wrote Strongmen, I saw that everywhere strongmen have come up, societies have struggled to recognize the danger before their eyes. And acknowledging that it can happen here means giving up some cherished notions about national identity. For example, it can't happen in Germany. We're so cultured. Germany didn't only have the high culture, it had the most advanced graphic design, engineering, science. Or the Chileans, who said, we're not going to have a coup like all these other countries around us. Our military is very democratic, devoted to the Constitution. And many Americans dismissed the notion that Trump's racism and his obsession with winning might help him win the election because they reflect enduring qualities of American society. So to conclude, strongmen like Putin are doubling down now because I think they know their time is limited, their scams are being revealed. They are rapaciously clinging to power and trying to exploit and hoard everything because they are the old paradigm of leadership and they have to block a new one from emerging. And that knowledge gives us an opportunity. And it's time for us to give democratic leaders and heroes the star treatment that's all too often lavished on strongmen and support other models of leadership and other imaginings of power. So, for example, why is this an acceptable way to hang out with friends, and yet this proved so controversial? A young, beautiful prime minister who negotiated Finland's accession to NATO and then went out partying and was criticized not only in Finland but everywhere else. So we have to develop models of power that see care, collaboration, and compassion as strengths, not weaknesses. It will not be easy, but there's too much at stake for us not to try. Thank you.
You gave us a lot, and you give us in your book even more about the qualities of the strongman and the operations of the strongman. But you're heavy on supply, but maybe not so much on demand. And I was wondering if you wanted to talk about what the circumstances are. I mean, you talk about transitions, but if you want to go on a bit more about why at this particular point in history they seem to be doing so well.
Yeah, I think if we take the recent case of Italy, where we have the first female prime minister and the first far-right minister. And there is a little bit symptomatic. It was partly a protest vote, because this is a party that has neo-fascist roots that got 26% of the vote. And it was partly a protest vote against other parties, in particular the center-left, which was seen as too establishment, too elitist, and not really having solutions to the economic woes that people had, not having the language, not having the unity. They didn't unify. And in general, there's sometimes a kind of reflexive caution that we're seeing in the center-left, where, like in Orban, the elections in the spring, everybody united against him, and that's what you have to do against autocrats. However, they, instead of providing a true progressive alternative, they included Jobbik, a far, far right party. And so they shifted right. And they thought in that way they could siphon votes away. But instead, all the people voted for Orban. It backfired. So that's an example of like a reflexive caution, not wanting to be truly progressive and not having unity and not having the solutions. And not also, last thing, it's been the right that's been able to play this politics of emotion and give people a sense of community, which they do that very well with the rallies, the feeling of tribalism. Of course, hate is one of the glues of this, but they know how to do it. And Democrats with a small d have not quite found their groove, I think, with that.
So I want to follow that line, but since you talked about the right, one question that immediately popped to mind when I was reading your book is, where is Juan Perón? And where are his many populist leftist followers, the strongmen of the left, which, after all, the first half of the 20th century, even longer, that was a big part of the story.
Yeah, and I do have Gaddafi in there, who was definitely a man of the extreme left.
Also the extreme right, the extreme middle, the extreme, he was all over the place.
Yes, he was all over the place.
Yeah.
Well, they're all very transactional.
Yeah.
But I'm a historian of fascism, and I wanted to show what happens after fascism ends. Where do these impulses and ideologies go? So I traced through fascism and then the military coups. And I think, for example, to understand Bolsonaro today, the danger he represents, you have to understand the military dictatorship in Brazil and Operation Condor, which was this terror and torture consortium in the Cold War that was US-backed. So I wanted to make that whole trajectory. And then you have Berlusconi, I'm an Italianist, and Italy gets really marginalized. It's extremely important as a political laboratory because Berlusconi was the first person to bring fascists into the government, briefly in the 90s, and he also was the first Putin, after Schroeder, he was the big Putin enabler. He's very, very important for everything that's today. So I was doing all of that, and I am a historian of the right, and, if I'd added all the left, it becomes a kind of encyclopedia. One thing that's interesting is that I get this question a lot. So I asked colleagues and peers who write histories of communism, and I said, do people get mad at you because you don't have fascists in there? And they said, no, I never get asked that because it's a whole thing, communism. And yet it's a logical question to ask, but there aren't that many books that go through the whole trajectory of the right and show how the heck did we get from the death of Mussolini and Hitler up to the right today, including people who were communists and became far rightists like Orban and Putin. I think you have to follow that through.
So it's probably in one of your other books. What went wrong in post-war Italian sort of reconstruction so that fascists could become, or neo-fascists or former fascists could be contemplated as being possible coalition partners? That has never happened in Germany.
No, because we cannot blame the Italians only for this, because the roots of this were in the Allies right after the war. They decided to treat Italy very differently than Germany, partly because the Cold War, Italy immediately had the biggest communist party. They decided to pursue a line that said that Italians were good people led astray by a bad man. Because of that, they did not destroy the symbols, they did not destroy the buildings, and they allowed a neo-fascist party, the Italian Social Movement, to be formed in 1946. By the 60s, now with Meloni, it's important to know this history, right? By the 60s, that neo-fascist party, which was totally all the fascists went there, the hardline fascists, its purpose was to keep fascism going. It was the fourth largest party in Italy, right? And the reason that Meloni founded, and her peers founded Brothers of Italy in 2012 is because the existing far-right party had fused with Berlusconi's party. And there was no autonomous extreme right party left. That's why she founded it. And in fact, if you look at the logo of the Brothers of Italy, she's got the flame in there. And now she's trying to say she's conservative, and so the flame is just patriotic, so the color's the flag. No, that is the flame of the original far-right, extreme right party, the neo-fascist party. And she insisted on keeping it there. And so there it is today. And she's the prime minister. So a totally different politics of memory. And Berlusconi was very destructive from my point of view. He had a whole politics of, trying to say that Mussolini never killed anyone. He told Boris Johnson when Johnson was a journalist. So and then bringing neo-fascism to the government. So these people have been normalized for a very long time. And in 2017, I wrote an article for The New Yorker, And they gave it, as you may know if you do journalism, you don't pick the title. And the editor called it, "Why Are So Many Fascist Monuments Still Standing?" And I wrote it thinking this is my first New Yorker piece. I was all excited. I was getting right into the New Yorker. I wasn't thinking about Italy, Italians. This caused a huge controversy because people thought that I was advocating the destruction of fascist monuments, the physical destruction, like with bulldozers. And so that was a very interesting episode of reaction against the idea that they would be treated like German. But in there, I have an example of Matteo Renzi, who's a man of the left. When he was pitching Rome to be the seat of the Olympics, he had the press conference in this fascist era sports complex. Fine, because it's the Olympics. But he sat underneath a giant portrait of Mussolini, like giant. It's like a fresco. And so in my article, I wrote, Angela Merkel would not be sitting under a huge thing of Hitler. It just wouldn't happen. And everyone went nuts in Italy because of that. That was just not supposed to be said. So it's a totally different
You were
memory.
supposed to just kind of pass over it and say, "Oh, what's that picture in the background?" Big deal.
It's extraordinary and this is Matteo Renzi. This was not a neo-fascist, but so it's been like normalized as part of the culture, and that's how we get to where we are today.
Mm-hmm. Gee, great.
Totally different. I know I'm depressing everyone. Sorry, but.
We do that a lot around here. I'm sorry. There was a book that came out that I'm sure you're aware of, whose title was so perfect that you almost felt like you didn't need to read the book. And it really does go a long way towards explaining, I think, a lot of the strongman, neo-fascist, authoritarian phenomena. And that is "The Cruelty is the Point." By Adam Serwer. And, you just, from that title, you just follow the line of reasoning that, in fact, by showing decisiveness that is manifest by cruelty, there is an appeal that is otherwise completely lost in modern bureaucratic society, where you have to wait online forever to get your driver's license, and you have to put up with all kinds of norms of behavior that you find aggravating and the like. And it seems to me that your book is belongs next to that, right on the bookshelf. And I'm trying to circle back here to my question about the demand side, and what is it about these people that is, so attractive, despite a track record of 100 years of failure?
Well, because these are people, when I said they come from, many of them outside the political system, but even if they don't, they have a certain charisma, they really know how to communicate. And here's the thing, they are opportunists. They are truly transactional beings. So they will be whatever people at that moment in that place need them to be. They don't have any moral code. And so they're like chameleons. And this is also why, from Mussolini up to Trump, they end up with these really weird, eclectic constituencies. You've got gangsters and housewives. You've got all kinds of people who don't fit together, but he is the glue. But the thing about The Cruelty and the Point, and I am very honored. I was asked to I was interviewed a few times by the January 6th committee, and I was asked to do a report on this stuff, strongmen, but what Trump did actually was very fascist. He did a very intensive emotional retraining of Americans at his rallies. And if you know fascism, it's like, oh my God, once you start looking for it. Starting in 2015, almost every rally, he had some comment about, in the old days, you used to be able to beat up people. And he was enabling cruelty as something, and violence as something attractive. right? And in that, it went so that plenty of people already were racist. Plenty of people didn't like immigrants. But the joy of hating and the joy of emotionally retraining people to think that cruelty is liberating, violence can be liberating, and that goes with the masculinity. Like all these people now, they're all writing on masculinity. Like Josh Hawley is writing a book. He's the guy who fled, you know, January 6th.
Senator from Missouri.
Yeah, all these cowards, whatever. But they were all writing about masculinity. But I also think that, you know, a question I get asked a lot is, why do these, you know, GOP politicians who already had good careers, they just like became such lackeys for Trump? And I think that if you take somebody like Lindsey Graham or even William Barr, and this is again seeing the worst of humanity from my studies, there's something liberating for people to serve a strongman for whom nothing is off limits. I mean, Trump is one of the most corrupt, he's unusual, he's one of the most corrupt individuals, and corrupt in so many ways. He's criminal in so many ways. And that's very liberating. And we know this from fascism. We know this from the juntas of the Cold War, that people find freedom in having the boundaries taken away. Because here's the last thing I'll say. Authoritarianism is about controls on people, some people, but it's about taking away restrictions for others. You can rape women, you can steal, you can plunder. And the law, of course, becomes turned into lawlessness. It enables this. So that's the demand. That's for some people the demand.
By the way, we're a totally nonpartisan organization. I just want to remind everyone here. I mean, the silver lining is that so many of these...
And it can happen with left-wing, too.
Yes, yes.
I'm talking about... What was so striking about the Trump case, though, is that he's a brilliant propagandist, and he was very intentional, and it really paid off in a place that does not have a history of national dictatorship. We had a form of regional authoritarianism and Jim Crow, but we did not have a junta like Brazil. And yet so it's a case study that's extremely interesting, and he did it in an open society. That's the other thing that's fascinating.
So one of the interesting things about President Trump, though, is that he's really not very effective at governing. I mean, he was really kind of incompetent. I think he passed one piece of legislation, a tax bill, in 4 years. He obviously changed America dramatically in many ways. Would you agree, though, that there's just sort of a matrix where, you know, the more corrupt you are, the more likely you are to fail? Are there really smart, corrupt people who are succeeding and not making big mistakes? I mean, I think of Putin as another one who is enormously corrupt. I mean, we know that he has tens of billions of dollars squirreled away, and yet, you know, he's blowing it. He had a chance to dominate his society far more than he will in the end, I think, because of the misadventure in Ukraine.
Well, he lasted 20 years, though. He's lasted the same amount as Mussolini and more than Pinochet. He's been there a long time. I think when we say that they're not effective, or, for example, that Trump was not interested in governing. Like, his goals were autocratic goals. The goals were making a profit off of public office. The goals were radicalizing people so that he would have a group of people who would do anything that he said. And now, you know, he's reaching out to QAnon. And that's very, very smart as a propagandist, because you've already they're an existing cult. And he's trying to have their sympathies go from whoever this Q person is, who doesn't hold rallies, whoever this Q is, to him, right? And that's so economical. So they actually are... I never like it when people say that Trump is lazy, because he worked really hard at the things he cared about. They're just not... They're not democratic goals. He worked hard at propagandizing, at generating hate, at making money for himself, blah, blah, blah. They're just not the regular goals.
Okay.
Same with Putin.
Okay, but are they the goals of a determined autocrat, or are they the goals of a profoundly avaricious person?
They're one and the same.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think. Autocrats, one of the interesting things is that many of them have similar personality traits. And one I've mentioned is that they really don't, they're completely opportunistic and transactional. But they also have this mania of, I call them hoarders. They must possess everything and everyone. They must have more and more loyalty. And so, in fact, the more power they get, the more paranoid they become, like Saddam Hussein, and the more they want. So there's a reason Mary Trump, who's a friend of mine, titled her book "Too Much Is Never Enough," I think, because that's the mentality.
Last question, we'll turn it over to the audience. Is Giorgia Meloni the first strong woman?
Yeah, I mean, we all thought it might be Le Pen, but it was her. And she actually is a kind of, there's this kind of tough Roman woman, and that's what she is. She had to be tough to come up and be so successful in neo-fascist culture. She became the head of the youth group, which was very, like, youth groups are always very extreme. And that was a big deal as a petite woman, but she's tough. So yes.
Questions? Please wait for the microphone. We'll start off right here in the front.
My name is Leslie Collett. I was the longest-serving Western correspondent in Berlin and Eastern Europe during the Cold War. I had the privilege of interviewing Viktor Orban when he was a student, fleeing from the police in his student quarters on his bed. And at that time, this was 1 year before he held this momentous speech on Heroes Square, where he touched on and exposed the one fact which could never be spoken about in Hungary, and that was 1956. And yet, here we have the complete revolution of a man who's become an authoritarian figure. You figure it out.
Well, this is an example of the chameleon and the opportunism, because he was voted out, and so he remade himself. And the thing is, from Mussolini up to Orban, these guys have extraordinary vision. They really are visionaries. I think they're awful. So this isn't really a compliment, but they see where things are going way before other people do, and they're able to remake themselves. Like Mussolini he was like Mr. Super Socialist, and then he became Mr. Fascist, right? So Orban realized that to have a career, you have to remake yourself in a different way, right? And he did this extremely successfully. So,
Right here.
Well, thank you for this talk and for the questions, which took care of some of my concerns, but here's the big one. So you say students of communism do not need to deal with fascism because communism, it's a thing, and so students of fascism do not need to take all the territory. But is that true? Your man Mussolini came out of the socialist movement. Hitler was a socialist.
of course,
National socialist. Let me continue. Carl Schmitt, he admired and feared the Bolsheviks for the same thing. He helped create dictatorship and legitimate and legalize, democratize dictatorship, and said, here are the Bolsheviks, they did it. They are men. So, okay, one question. But the other is, progressive seems to be a good word, right? There is no more progressive empire than the Soviet Empire was. You read their documents, they're all beautiful ideas. And they are women on tractors, right? And they're this and that. And yet they killed many, many, many more men than any other fascists together. So I'm wondering, by fixating our attention on the right and on the fascist movement, not explaining its connection to the beautiful progressive ideas out of which it came. Are you really doing service to our movement or potential disservice, right? Maybe we're not looking in the right direction or not looking at the causes, but rather at symptoms.
I think that obviously, and I state this throughout the book, there were a huge amount of interchanges between the left and the right. In fact, just for personality cults alone, Mussolini really learned from Lenin's cult. And then there was, in my first book, I have an extensive part about how hundreds of Italian journalists and scholars went to Stalinist Russia to learn about mass, culture, all kinds of things. And so that would have been a different book. And there are many episodes of very interesting borrowings and alliances, such as Mobutu and Ceausescu. It's a just as important history, but that's not the history I was writing. I wanted to write this history that I felt hadn't been written. It doesn't mean that I think that there's no importance to those other things. As for Hitler being a socialist, this is a right-wing talking point that you hear a lot, that fascism was really leftist because people want to blame the violence on the left. And so I just remind people that the very first victims of fascism were leftists in both Germany and in Italy. So.
Hi, I'm Tom O'Donnell. I work on energy and geopolitics. I have a few questions, but I got to think which one to ask you. So, for many years, when you hear the discussion of the characteristics of authoritarian leaders or fascist leaders, I mean, it's interesting, but I'm always left with, okay, now what do you do with this? And my focus is more on, and maybe you could speak about this, is why, there are these kinds of people in all societies, and who would gather up similar groups if they had the opportunity, like the way Trump cleaned the swamp and brought all these corrupt people with him. But to me, the real question is, what's the failure beforehand that allows this to take place? Mm-hmm. And
totally.
I actually stayed in Venezuela longer because I wanted to see the transition to sort of dictatorship and see what would happen. And but there, my feeling was what happened is, and it's a similar feeling I have about Brazil, is it was actually success in the sense of society was changing. Even people in the barrio were becoming middle class. There was a significant new middle class who had demands that the traditional originally democratic, paternalistic government could not deal with by clientelism. And the governments failed, and that's how you got these people. Mm-hmm. Now, it could have been right, it could have been left, it depends on what's going on. But I can't see any real difference between what Chavez did and some of what I listened to many of his speeches. Mm-hmm. So that's one question. And in the United States, there's also this problem, is that clearly the liberal democracy was failing in the sense of the Democratic Party. You said something about this response to the end of traditional relationships. Mm-hmm. I think that was more a phase one thing. That was like up to Newt Gingrich, especially it was Reagan. Newt Gingrich would have been worse. He's more intelligent. Trump is sort of a phase two. Mm-hmm. It's not just the direct, that sort of had its place. What happened now is there's all these people in the United States who really don't have a future. Trump is right. He speaks directly to them, and he's right. He knows how to speak to them because he's on television, and he read the Nielsen ratings every time he got off. He knew what worked. That the Democratic Party failed to accomplish the things they promised, and liberals. And this is very similar to the EU, I think, and to Germany also, in many ways. And so that's the danger that creates how some opportunists will come along and do it. So I don't want to deprecate what you're doing, but I'm saying it's that connection that I'm interested in. Maybe you could say something.
Yeah, no, what is the failure before is an excellent question. And, sometimes sometimes the failure is a selfishness, or that's an understatement of conservative elites who, I mean, you really see this as the book is about patterns too. I mean, time and again, you know, it's not just the Germans with Hitler, it's that they really think they're going to solve their problems by bringing this person into the system and thinking they can control. And there the failure is you know, a lack of vision, a selfishness, and egotism. But what was really struck me is, even in Chile, after the coup, so here we had a coup, and it wasn't really a surprise, but it was a coup, right? The Christian Democrats, who were the conservative elites, actually thought they kept backing Pinochet and the junta because they actually thought that they would rule for 6 months and calm things down and then give back power to them. So that's a failure of imagination, to say the least. This really struck me because the cases of Hitler and Mussolini are well known, and they came up through in time, and there were elections. Here it's a coup, and they're still stuck in this same, like, what more proof did you need, you know, of the violence? And yet they still are doing this. And in the case of the States, you're absolutely right. I go back to the Tea Party, but again, that would have been a different book. And many people have, Tim Alberta, there's lots of good books on how Trump came to be, right? But the big failures in the American system, which are now tragically getting out of control, are the failure to recognize the danger of extremism. Like, what other country has, I always do the comparative thing, has these, if you know Malcolm Nance, do you know, he's a journalist, and he's now a fighter in Ukraine. He calls them, excuse my language, fake-ass constitutional sheriffs. So what other country would tolerate having sheriffs who are called sovereign sheriffs who don't believe in the federal government? These are far-right extremists who are sheriffs. And that's one thing. These extremists are in all the institutions, and we saw this on January 6th. The second, like, obvious thing is guns. And the gun problem is again, there's no other country in peacetime that allows citizens to have enormous arsenals, military-grade weapons. And I wrote a piece for the Washington Post called "Gun Violence Primes Us for Authoritarianism," because making the public sphere a place of terror, ruining public schools. What are public schools? They're places where people of different nationalities, races, cultures mix, right? They're places of democratic socialization. And there is a design on the right, including the Christian right, because these are secular, to make schools places of terror, to make the public sphere a place of suspicion. And they're doing it in a passive way by refusing to deal with the gun problem. So that's the wild card of America is guns. That's what I worry about. Not the most, but that's up there. So that's a failure.
No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the fact that the working class in America is in the white middle.
No, yeah, you're absolutely. I agree with you.
They're dying of drug overdoses. They have to have 3-4 jobs.
Yeah.
And they've been promised by one administration after another that something was going to be done. And it's never
Republican
done.
and Democrat.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. So I didn't comment on that. And Trump knew how to speak. Trump knew how to speak to these people. That's the genius, is that they know how to speak to these people. They use the language of emotion. You are the forgotten. You are forgotten no longer.
And they are the forgotten.
So.
Thank you very much for the. It was very interesting to see all these patterns, and we just discussed the beginning of the rise, the beginning and the rise, and then part of the title was the fall, and maybe you can talk a bit about the fall. What makes them fall? So, because sooner or later they fall, hopefully, or more or less. And what is the behavior? Do they take everything with them, or everybody's now speculating what Putin is going to do in the situation he's in? And so what are the patterns you found in researching? Or
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different outcomes. One pattern is this kind of severe mismanagement due to corruption, which gets to a point where the population, like in Mobutu, he's in my book in the Congo, where the average person was making $1 a day, and he had $500 million stashed away. So that kind of severe mismanagement can cause all kind of rebellions. Sometimes it's if in the Cold War and after, if you are there because of a foreign backer, and the foreign backer decides they no longer have a need for you. It's a combination of things. Like Pinochet in Chile is interesting because he was one of the only strongmen who got voted out. But that was possible because the Americans decided he wasn't useful anymore. They got sick of him. And so circumstances changed, and so they allowed the beginning of a democracy movement, and then you had huge protests, and you were able to get a referendum, and he was voted out. Many other times they have to go into exile, right? But one thing that's interesting, if you think of the Philippines today, where, once these guys get in the system, it's kind of hard to get rid of them because, as in the Philippines, now you have Bong Bong, who's back. So Marcos, went into exile, but a very strong lobby kept the nostalgia for the Marcos and the golden period of martial law as calm. And what can happen sometimes is, so they left under disgrace, but then they somehow get rehabilitated. So that can happen. Or, of course, you have the violent outcomes like Ceausescu and, Mussolini. And I think about Hitler a lot when I'm thinking about Putin, the way he behaves. In terms of his ending, I also think about Mussolini, who did the autocratic backfire, and he kept going into these ruinous military campaigns, things he volunteered to do to, curry favor with Hitler. He didn't even need to send people to the Russian front. And he ended up with a palace coup, right? He was voted out, and then Hitler rescued him. So since the beginning of the war, I've been thinking about elite defection. It's very difficult in Russia because look how many people have fallen out of windows in the energy sector. And those are, of course, that came early as warnings. But also because he's been there for so long and the kleptocracy is so well developed, the elites are kind of bought into the corruption. It's so endemic that it's difficult to extricate what will the goal be? Will the whole system have to fall down? And then the final thing is that they don't have successors. Because they're paranoid, because they're megalomania, there's no successor mechanism. And that's also why they end up badly. Because there's no natural way to get them out.
You had your hand up on. No, you moved on? Yeah. Oh, you do want to ask a question. Okay, sorry.
I'm wondering, you were talking that hate is a key element, but who does the strongman hate? Does he need a domestic enemy, or is, let's say, an external strongman a good object or good enemy and image to fight against? What's your findings in comparison?
In terms of, it's very interesting that the same groups come in for targeting across 100 years. So, gay people, nomadic peoples, could be Roma and Sinti, could be in Italian fascists committed, nobody even knows this, they committed genocide in Libya of Bedouin. If it's a right-wing dictatorship, obviously the left. the homeless, the extreme poor. So over and over again, Jews, and then today Muslims, non-Christians, right? It's like a recycling of the same people, and who are victims. And it's also interesting to see the patterns in rhetoric, where today it's George Soros, right? Maloney calls him an international speculator. Well, it's like so obvious. That's the code for anti-Semitism. And so, for example, in the fascist years, Hitler and Mussolini were, they wanted to destroy the international state system. That was the League of Nations. That was unfair. Today, it's the EU, it's NATO, but the victimization complex and so those are the external enemies. It has to be a whole system that is arranged against them and the nation. That you can slot in different names for what that system is, but the psychological, emotional mechanism of the victimization and how they're going to be the saviors doesn't change. So that's a partial answer.
I think there's a difference between, for instance, between the United States, where with a democracy Trump was elected, and there's Putin on the other side, who was elected, but he was not elected. And if we look, I think we have to see that democracy has a problem. People want to have things done. And my example is Singapore. Singapore is not democratic, but it's excellent ruled. There's no corruption. There's all these things that you mentioned, but that Mr. Putin or Mr. Trump is not there. People say, well, it's small, but it's not smaller than Berlin is. And if you look on Germany as an example for democracy, people get fed up with what happens. The democracy with the NGOs who took over, who are more powerful than those who are elected, and it takes 5, 7, 10, 15 years until something is done. And if somebody comes, I wouldn't say like Hitler, but if somebody comes who shows that he gets things done, then you get people like Trump. And this is a problem. This is not a question, but I think in your, I mean, you showed the bad man, okay, but what is the result?
No, I think you're absolutely right that these, in fact, I always say it's, in terms of when they succeed, it's a meeting of circumstance and personality. And it often is when people are frustrated with the political system and somebody comes in who shocks the system by being decisive, and by, speaking in a way, like when Trump spoke in his, first when he got the nomination and then his inaugural address, he said, "The carnage stops today." What did he say? Like, now the time for words is over, now is the time of action. And we were all like, oh my God, that's not good. And George Bush he was at the inauguration, and George Bush Jr., and he didn't know. He said to Michelle Obama, excuse my language, it's his language, he said, "That's some weird shit." Because it was gloom and doom, and then Trump was going to save everyone, and he didn't have a reference point for this apocalyptic crisis and decision-making. Like this, in Italian you say decisionismo, like somebody who comes in and decides. And that's very appealing. That's part of the appeal of fascism, and like Susan Sontag and others have written about that. But yes, it's a real thing, of course. I personally, my own ethics, I don't think it's a good way, and it has bad results, but it appeals to people, for sure, especially if they're frustrated with the way things are going. Absolutely.
Eckhart, you got a question?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to follow a little bit the idea, I think, of Mr. Herios. My thesis is these strongmen can only be successful if they have a point. something that traditional or established politicians of politics has overseen or neglected. And maybe one reason for Trump's success is neglecting the situation of the blue-collar workers in the Midwest, around Detroit. Then Democratic candidates talking about these people as a basket of deplorables. And then a mechanism starts. If then others take these points to avoid that these points are misused by those right-wing populists or fascists or however you call them, then these people are blamed for being also populists. So, and then a vicious circle, I would say, of mutual radicalization starts. And then you leave more and more the middle ground. And do you share this? Or and at the end, if, for instance, a very simple example, I fully share what you have said about the discrimination of LGBTQ and so on. But if, for instance, from the liberal left, someone is blamed being right-wing populist, if he, for instance, argues that women should have their separate restrooms, then, of course, the discussion goes in a way that leads to that escalation I try to describe.
I think you're absolutely right about them, and this picks up on things other people said about the mistakes that Democrats with a small d make in not taking seriously the pain and the suffering of others, or seeming to be elite. This is why I mentioned at the beginning the problems of the Democratic center left in Italy, where they were truly seen as elitist and totally disconnected. Now, from the point of view of disinformation studies, an important research finding is if you want to try and approach somebody who's in the tunnel of disinformation, you cannot condescend to them, you cannot judge them. It's a little bit what you're saying. You have to approach them and listen and ask them why. Why do you believe this? So to take their concerns seriously. And all the research on disinformation coming from different points of view shows this. Because if you study cults also, there's a very interesting phase of when people are starting to realize that perhaps they were misinformed or duped. They become more defensive. And that's when if you try and they're very afraid of being judged. They're very afraid of people saying, you were so stupid, you fell for plug-in name of, corrupt politician. And so you have to be and it's hard. My own mother got radicalized during the pandemic watching RT in England. And she became like a total pro-Putin. And it was very difficult to not yell at her. But that's not the way to go. So yes, taking the concerns of constituencies that are hurting seriously is something that it's one of the lessons that we Democrats can learn without the hate.
I'm afraid we have time for just one last question, so we're going to ask it right here.
Thank you so much. Helmut Anheier from the Hertie School of Governance, and being at a public policy school, we like to think about how can we prevent bad things from happening. And in your talk, you had a very useful set of tools to rule. Could you think of a similar set of ways to prevent strongman from emerging, kind of an early warning system? And, and related to the question, if I may, let's say in 50 years from now, do you think someone like you would write a book on strong women?
Not even 50 years from now, you could, because there's just to start with that. So there's it's not my concept. It's two female political scientists who have this concept of gender washing, which is because it's not just Le Pen and it's not just Meloni. There's also Katalin Novak in Hungary, who was Minister of Family, and now she's the president. She's the first female president of Hungary. It's a figurehead because Orban is Orban, but they claim to stand for the rights of women because they are women. And instead, like you look with Meloni, the places her party already governs, they take away abortion rights or they make it more difficult for people to access abortion. So, yes, there's a lot to say about the strong woman. The early warning signs is interesting, and there are lots of documents now that are coming out with the early warning signs. And one of them, I mentioned, which is they tell you who they are very early. I gave you the example of the violence because that's like the red flag. But they also, from the very start, refused transparency. Like, again, Trump did not. He wouldn't release his tax. They flaunt the norms. And they can be small things like the Hatch Act or, conflicts of interest. But
Quickly explain the Hatch Act for...
Yeah, that you're not supposed to, as a government employee, you're not supposed to have political
activity.
Yeah, but so but it's very key that they do a lot of these things nowadays because you come to power through elections during the campaign. So they're training the population, they're testing. So it's corruption, non-transparency, lack of accountability, often, misogyny, all of the tools. And so those are some early warning signs. The other, ideally, you have to do gatekeeping. And in 2019 in Italy, the other parties successfully banded together to stop Matteo Salvini, who was very dangerous, from getting power. Now, that doesn't work in America because we don't have a multi-party system. So some of these things that are early warning and what to do work with coalition governments. They don't work. We have a structural problem in America. So it's just a partial answer.
Okay. Well, this was an incredibly stimulating, not always
Thank you for the wonderful
uplifting
questions.
discussion. Thank you, Ruth Ben-Ghiat.